Okay, so I want to do something a little different today. I want to talk about Tisha B'av. And just to try to give us a little bit of a simple but very important understanding that I think will be very compelling to understand Tisha B'av, to understand what it is, and to understand the place that it sits within Jewish life. You know, if you look at the laws, we're in now at the very end of the 3 weeks. There were 3 weeks of mourning from the 17th of Tammuz until the 9th of Av. And during those 3 weeks of mourning, so we don't take haircuts, we don't shave, we don't make weddings, we don't make parties, we don't listen to live music. And then as the 9 days come, it gets more serious. For the Ashkenazim, we don't eat meat, we don't drink wine. We don't do laundry. It's like Shiva. We don't do laundry. We don't bathe for pleasure. And then the week that Tisha B'av falls in, which is now, so then it steps up a little bit. Then Erev Tisha B'av, it gets even a little more serious. And then on Tisha B'av itself, like Yom Kippur, we don't wear leather shoes. We don't anoint ourselves. We don't wash. We don't eat. We don't do those things called the Chamishi Inuyim, the 5 things that we don't do on Tisha B'av. On Yom Kippur, we don't do them on Tisha B'av either. And no marital relations on Tisha B'av. And it is a day where we sit on the floor from the nighttime until midday on the day of Tisha B'av. And we lament. There are a lot of tears on Tisha B'av. It's an emotional service. It's an emotional time. And we don't just remember the destruction of the temple, we actually remember 2,000 years of Jewish suffering. There are, of the things that we do in the service on Tisha B'av Day, the recitation of Kinos, it's called, of Lamentations, there are in fact many of them that deal with the Crusades, with the Spanish Inquisition. There is Lamentations that we recite for the Holocaust. Every tragedy that's happened in Judaism is remembered on Tisha B'av. But if you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, you look back 1,800, 2,000 years, and you find the laws are very different than they are today. Today, what's accepted in laws in the Shulchan Aruch and the Code of Jewish Law is much stricter than the law that was presented in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in general, we find that there is a general shift to the right in Torah Judaism, and we wonder why we get stricter as time goes on. So the Bach, one of the commentaries on part of the Shulchan Aruch of the Code of Jewish Law, the Bach explains that the reason that we get stricter as time goes on, because the nations of the world are poised at trying to get us to step back from our observance, to try to drive a wedge between us and our observance. And because they're tearing down the walls that we have built in order to protect our observance, therefore, when they tear them down, the stronger they tear them down, the stronger we have to rebuild them. And that's why as generations go on, in every single generation, we get stricter and stricter because the walls need to be higher and higher because the threat against them becomes greater and greater. Now that Bach is beautiful, and I understand then why I need to be stricter in things, but that would explain why I need to be stricter in the laws of kashrus, because they're trying to take it away from me. Look at every country that we're in now, right? Except for America, only because it doesn't have the guts yet. But we'll get there one day. That try to take away shchita. They try to take away ritual slaughtering of animals, right? You look at the European countries that have prohibited the ritual slaughter. Bris Milah. Many of the nations of the world are uncomfortable with bris milah and feel that it's a barbaric thing that we do. They are poised at trying to remove us and to disconnect us from our heritage, our practices, our lives. And therefore, I understand that we need to build the walls even stronger. And therefore, we need to become more precise and punctilious about things because of all the threats against it. But that doesn't explain mourning. Why would they care if I mourn? I can understand that they would want to get me to stop keeping Shabbos, stop keeping kosher, stop slaughtering animals, stop doing bris milah. I can understand. Those are identity things. But mourning, they should look at us on Tisha B'av and say, knock yourselves out. Maybe you want to do it for a whole week. Like, keep going. Make yourself sad. What do I care? Cry your eyes out. Why the nations of the world, do they care for 1 second whether I mourn or whether I don't mourn? Why are they poised at trying to take that away from me in order to be able to, that I then need to build the walls even stronger? So that's what I want to talk about. Because I guarantee you that you all think that Tisha B'av is about the destruction of the temple. We commemorate the destruction of the temple. We even commemorate, the way I just explained it, all the tragedies that happened to the Jewish people, all the dead Jews, all the Holocaust. And that might be the reason why we find it hard to connect to Tisha B'av. But what I'm going to explain in the next couple of minutes is that that's not the essence of Tisha B'av. If you hear classes about Tisha B'av, invariably what you'll hear is they'll talk about sinat chinam, unjustified hatred, because the temple was destroyed because of unjustified hatred. And that Tisha B'av becomes about love and loving each other and that we shouldn't hate each other. And it's beautiful, but it's not the essence of Tisha B'av. And that's what I want to try to explain in the next couple of minutes. It's a beautiful story about a sage, a great sage that was once staying in an inn that was far from his house. And late at night, we have a custom at midnight to arise and to say what's called tikkun chatzos. Tikkun chatzos, chatzos means midnight, and to lament over the destruction of the temple, not just on Tisha B'av, but every single day of the year, except for Shabbos. And to wake up at midnight and to cry out for the temple. It's a practice of the pious people. It's done today still in Yerushalayim. You can go to the Kotel in the middle of the night, at midnight, at halachic midnight, and you will find people sitting there crying their eyes out every single night over the destruction of the temple, asking God to rebuild the temple. So this rabbi who was in this hotel came midnight and he was crying bitter tears, saying Tikkun Chatzot. The innkeeper comes running in. He hears crying. His wife says, go find out what's going on with the rabbi. He runs into the room and the rabbi says, Rabbi, what happened? Why are you crying? So he says, I'm crying because our holy temple was destroyed. So the guy says, oh, okay. And he goes back to his wife. And then he comes back to the rabbi and he says, look, my wife understands that, it's a sad thing, but why exactly are you crying? So he explains to the man that we're waiting for Messiah to come, for Mashiach to come, and he's going to bring us all to Eretz Yisrael, bring us all to the land of Israel. The guy goes back to his wife. He comes back to the rabbi, and he says, look, I told my wife that when Mashiach comes, we're all going to Israel, and she wasn't really happy about that. So she asked if you'd please stop crying and please stop praying because she doesn't want to go to Israel. So he says, doesn't want to go to Israel? What's the matter with you? In Israel, everything's going to be so beautiful. We're going to be living in Jerusalem. The temple's going to be rebuilt. There's going to be peace in the world. Why did you want to go to Jerusalem? The guy says, I don't know. So he goes back to his wife, comes back to the rabbi, and he says, no, my wife says that we have chickens. We're raising the chickens. And, she can't go to Israel right now because she's busy raising chickens. The rabbi gets crazy. Like he's so upset with the guy. He says, I don't understand. In every generation, they attack us. They try to destroy us. They try to decimate us. They try to wipe us out, obliterate us from the face of this world. We have so many enemies. I don't understand. You're worried about the chickens? So he goes back to his wife, comes back to the rabbi, and he says, you know what? My wife said you can continue praying for the Messiah. And she's okay if the Messiah comes. You and all of our enemies will go to Israel, and she'll stay back here with the chickens. Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of people relate to this concept of Mashiach. That Mashiach will come, Messiah will come, and that, let them go to Israel. But I'm not ready myself. I'm not ready yet. We don't get the point, and we continue not to get the point. We don't get the point that we are missing something and that we're happy to stay here with the chickens. Let our enemies go to Israel. Let our enemies get out of here. But listen, I have a life. Because we don't look at the world that we live in and the life that we lead, and we don't recognize that in this present condition, we're really missing something. But how can it be so hard to get the point that something's missing? So I'm going to tell you a very, very difficult story, a mashal. There was once a childless couple who were trying for years and years and years to have children. And finally, the woman becomes pregnant. They have a child. And the woman dies very soon after the birth of the child. And as she dies, she says to her husband, please remember to teach the child to say Kaddish for me. And the husband teaches the child how to say Kaddish. And the child is 9, 10, 11. And the child says Kaddish. And if you ask him, he'll tell you he's saying Kaddish for his mother. But he fidgets when he says Kaddish. He's looking around. He's throwing things at his friends. Finally, 1 year on the yard site, when the son is saying Kaddish, no feeling, no emotion, the father blasts the child and he says to him, what's the matter with you? How can you say Kaddish for your mother that way? And the kid looks at his father and he says, Daddy, I never knew Mommy. I didn't know who she was. What do you want from me? We never knew Mommy. We never knew the Beis HaMikdash. We never knew the temple. We never knew what it was like to live in peace, to live with God, to live with that kind of spirituality, to live with going to the temple and seeing miracles every single day. But the truth is that if we never knew Mommy, then it's not just hard for us to feel any kind of emotion on Tisha B'av. It's almost impossible for us to feel an emotion on Tisha B'av. Because how am I going to get emotional to something that I have no connection to? You know, for some of you that have been studying with me for a while, when I say the word temple, Beis HaMikdash, you have a little bit of a picture. I've shown you pictures, I've shown you models, I've shown you the floor plan of the temple. I've spoken about korbanos, about sacrifices. So you have a little, maybe a little taste, but it's just a little taste. You've gone to Israel, and maybe if we've been on a tour together, so I've shown you the Beis HaMikdash, where the Beis HaMikdash would stand. I've shown you models, but it's just a little taste. It's no real connection. So how am I supposed to feel bad on the day that we commemorate the destruction of the temple? In the same way that it's difficult for me to really feel the Holocaust. And I've been to Europe, I've stood in Auschwitz, but I have no real frame of reference other than I can see the buildings. But I've never lived that way. I've never been oppressed that way. I've never been scared that way. But I think that in that lies the problem. Is that I think that I need to have a connection to buildings, and I think that I need to have a connection to history, and I think that I need to have connection to rituals, to sacrifices, and that's not what Tisha B'av is about. We're focusing on the wrong things. When we talk about the temple, what we talk about is a place where there was a connection between us and God. And when the temple was destroyed, it wasn't that a building was destroyed, but it's that my connection, my frontal, face-to-face connection with God, there was a mechitza shel barzel. There was a steel barrier that was placed in between me and God. And what I'm living in is I'm living in a world of disconnection. You know, when they took over the Kotel in 1967, there were two soldiers, secular soldiers, that had fought hard to get back into Jerusalem. And one of them was weeping. And the other soldier looks at him and says, "What are you weeping for? You're not religious. It doesn't have any religious significance to you. Why are you weeping?" He said, "Ani boche biglal shani lo boche." I'm crying because I'm not crying. Because I don't feel that emotional connection. And I don't feel that for all these years we were living with that emotional disconnection, with that spiritual disconnection. And that's the tragedy of Tisha B'av. The tragedy of Tisha B'av is that we're so disconnected that we don't even realize that we're disconnected and missing something. You know, it's an incredible thing. I remember when I lived in Australia, they warned me that most of my congregation was not religious and that when I did something on Tisha B'av, most people weren't going to come. Baruch Hashem, a lot of people came. They had never seen Tisha B'av before. We educated, we taught. But Tisha B'av afternoon, I went for a walk. And as I was walking on the street, I passed by the backyard of one of my congregants. And I could hear voices. I recognized many of them. And I realized that they were having a barbecue. Tisha B'av afternoon. You know, I can't tell you how many people don't fast on Tisha B'av. How many people have no inkling of what Tisha B'av is. And that's the tragedy of Tisha B'av. Tisha B'av is about realizing that we are disconnected from God. And as long as I don't feel that disconnection, then I'm not motivated to make a connection. I'm not motivated to look for a way to be able to connect myself to God. That's the real tragedy. The real tragedy is that we have created this barrier and we live behind this barrier. The sinas chinam, the unjustified hatred, which destroyed the temple, the idolatry, the adultery, and the murder that destroyed the temple, those are just symptoms. The real issue and the real disease is bidud. Bidud means aloneness, separateness, isolation. It's what happens nowadays when you go to Israel. You got to spend 2 weeks in bidud, 2 weeks in isolation. It means totally alone, absolutely separated from everyone. But the bidud that we feel is the bidud, the separation from God. And that unfortunately we don't feel that. We don't feel that aloneness. We don't feel that separateness. And that's the tragedy of Tisha B'av. As long as we stay disconnected, there is no real hope for the Jewish people. Because everything that we connect to is just external things. Hamantaschen, dreidels, sufganiyot, skishmak. It's Jewish, chicken soup, Shabbat, meals. But if it's not about drawing closer to the master of the universe, if it's not about drawing closer to God, then it's just on the outside. It's just on the surface, on the veneer. It's not intrinsic. It's not something that's deep. As long as I stay on the surface, then Judaism will continue to erode. And that's why the nations of the world want to make sure that we don't mourn on Tisha B'av. That's why it's to their advantage if they can push us away from Tisha B'av, if they can be successful at disconnecting us from Tisha B'av. Because what Tisha B'av does for us in its saddest of ways, but it reminds us to aspire to drawing closer to God and to trying to break down this steel barrier that exists between us and God. You know, Napoleon Bonaparte was once walking through the Jewish quarter, and it happened to be Tisha B'av night. And he heard wailing and crying coming from the synagogues. He looked into one of the synagogues, and he saw people sitting on the floor. The lights were out, candles were in their hand, and they were crying, veining, mamish, crying. He turns to one of his guys and he says, "What's going on here?" "Oh, it's the Jews are crying over their temple that was destroyed in Jerusalem." And this is a true story. Napoleon says, "Temple was destroyed in Jerusalem? Let's go build it." And they said to him, No. It wasn't just destroyed now. It was destroyed over 1,500 years ago. Napoleon said, and they're still crying over a temple after 1,500 years? A nation that can still muster tears after 1,500 years, that nation will never be destroyed, says Napoleon Bonaparte. Because he knew what we don't, that they were crying over a connection to God. And if we can't feel that disconnection, and we can't cry over that disconnection, so then the future is bleak. Tisha B'av, it's a sad day. But the sadness is when I come to the realization of this separation. But it's also a joyous day. It's a day where we commit ourselves to start rebuilding. Not building materials, not actually building, but by building ourselves and connecting ourselves, that is the foundation of the building of the temple. I wish there was a way to disseminate this message, because I don't believe that most Jews, when they hear this, that Tisha B'av is about being disconnected, being separated from God, that it's not something that touches people. In other words, I believe that it touches people because everybody wants to have a relationship with God. Most people want to have a relationship with God. Tisha B'av is not about buildings. Tisha B'av is not about tragedies. Tisha B'av is about the source of all the tragedies when we disconnect ourselves from God. It's I think, a little bit of a different perspective, but an essential perspective of what Tisha B'av is and of how to relate to it in a very real kind of way. I don't have to know a thing about the temple. I don't have to know a thing about history. All I have to know is that I want to live in a world of peace. And I want to live in a world of spirituality. I want to live in a world of happiness. I want to live in a world of joy. And that's what my connection to God brings me. And therefore, I need first to underscore the separation, and then I can commit myself to the reconnection. Just a thought. Something to hopefully take with you a little bit on Tisha B'av. Wednesday night till Thursday night. It's a Yom Kippur type fast in the sense that it's not most of our other fasts start in the morning and end at night. Tisha B'av starts at night and ends at night. It's a 25-hour fast. Not the easiest of fasts, But I'll tell you, this year there's a great advantage, and the reason is that to motivate oneself to go to shul is like a little hard in a good year. But what's available online is unbelievable. Videos, movies, history, like just an amazing amount of things that are available that make it simple, even without having to worry about the liturgy. There's special davening on it, but don't even worry about that. But just to get the meaning, all you got to do is type in Tisha B'av, and you'll come up with an enormous amount of things. I think that it's a good idea to try to get to understand it better, because it really is something very fundamental to Judaism. It's not like a graduate level kind of thing, extra credit. It's really something very fundamental to our relationship with Judaism, our relationship with God, our relationship with Israel, and our relationship with each other. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes,
can you send us some links
yes,
to watch?
I'm going to send links. I'm also going to send some of my stuff on Tisha B'av, and